Hi, everybody. Today's lesson will be looking at fiscal policy. It's a continuation of the longer lesson we had yesterday. This is a shorter lesson, but essentially the goal for the lesson will be to look at two things. First and foremost, we'll briefly review and reiterate some of the benefits of fiscal policy, but we'll also look at some of the challenges that come with using this particular tool set. There will be a companion piece next unit when we start to look at monetary policy. You'll see that oftentimes governments, when they use policy, may prefer actually to use their monetary policy toolset as opposed to their fiscal policy toolset in certain circumstances, and vice versa. This lesson will give you a portion of that information, and then in a few weeks, we'll sort of pair that up with the monetary policy discussion, and you'll get to sort of see why you would want to use one policy toolset versus the other. So in terms of fiscal policy, there are, and I've posted this, but there are a few key advantages worth acknowledging. Probably the biggest benefit to fiscal policy, and it's the most obvious one, is the fact that it's direct and it's targeted. Particularly when you're using government spending, so things like stimulus, there's a general knowledge that if you need money in your economy and you spend money, you know that money will go to people. And you can target where you want to put that money in terms of location. You can target where you want to put it in terms of kind of economic activity and what you want to be buying, who you want to be giving it to. And so certainly that's one of the big benefits, is that as a government, it's kind of like a checkbook that you can use to put money in where it specifically is required. Second benefit to fiscal policy, I think sometimes it can almost be a bit of a drawback, but in a general sense, it's a benefit, is the fact that when you're looking at fiscal policy, it has certain marketing benefits, and it's definitely easy to promote. One of the key core things that you're trying to do as a government running an economy is not just to sort of spend your own money, but make people feel confident so that they want to invest and do good things with money that they have of their own. And so if the government's able to sort of market and promote the idea that, hey, things are a little down, but we're confident, we're spending money, then the hope is that that will actually become a little bit of a sort of domino effect, and that the dollars the government spend will, through inspiring people, through sort of the marketing end that goes with things, to feel like, okay, well, maybe it's time for us to start take a few chances and get this economy moving again. And so that's definitely a benefit. If you look at sort of fiscal policy traditionally, it's often been accompanied by a huge sort of media marketing push by the government. Right back to the New Deal of FDR, when he introduced a lot of those policies to get money into the economy. One of the most famous things he did with that in the 1930s was he used, of course, the tool that was available to him within the day, the radio, to have what were called fireside chats. And that's a term that's sort of taken on its own meaning over the years. But essentially, the idea was that Mr. Roosevelt would, I don't know if he actually had a fire, but he would sit within his office in the White House, and he would calmly talk to Americans about, here's what I'm doing, here's why you should feel good about the steps that the government is taking. And the hope was that that would actually not only make his government look good, which of course was an objective, but also sort of make people feel a little bit better than they had about what was going on in the economy. If you look at sort of modern day equivalents, when you hear all the stimulus sorts of packages that the government is introducing, Canada, United States, other places, they don't just sort of silently put those things out there, but they very publicly announce what's happening. And the goal is, again, to kind of encourage people to feel good about what's happening and maybe follow suit. If you're cynical, is there a sort of self-interest principle at play? Of course there is, but it doesn't mean that the policy isn't useful. Third is the idea that you can regionally target fiscal policy. You're going to see, compared to monetary policy, that's actually one of the biggest benefits, is that if you are a government that needs to spend money, and there's particular areas that require it more than others, then you can adjust and sort of use it where it would be best suited. I guess the one dilemma with that is that some regions may complain if they're not getting the funds that other ones may. But certainly if you had a situation where, let's say, for example, in the mid-1990s, this happened in Canada, Newfoundland, their fishing industry collapsed, and it had a horrible localized recession in an era where most of the country wasn't really going through the recession. Well, there was an opportunity not just for Newfoundland's government, but also the much more wealthy government of Canada to actually put money into that particular region and create stimulus that was a localized and sort of necessary thing, but only within a pocket of Canada. The final, and I think it's a really important point that I've put down here. These are not the only four benefits of fiscal policy, but they're some of the primary ones. Is that its accountability is high. Typically speaking, the people who would put fiscal policy into place would be your governments, federal, provincial. When they do so, the tools they use would be legislation. And in fact, there's an important piece of legislation every spring called a budget, where the government of the day will have to present to the House and indirectly to the people of Canada, because of course it's televised and heavily written about, here is our plan for what we want to do. And if you don't like that as a citizen, well, you have representative democracy. You have the right to vote for a government that does put together a spending plan that you approve of. Now, when you vote, you're not just primarily thinking about spending and government sort of finances, but certainly it's a big part of the equation. And every time they ask people, what do you think is important when you're voting? Always within the top three, the economy would be there. So if you really feel like your government's mismanaging your funds and you don't think they've done a good job of fiscal policy or other policies, well, then they're accountable for what they've done. You can make them accountable by choosing to vote for another party. Yeah. Okay, so you get the idea. Now, the second part of the note is a little bit more detailed, but it talks about some of the drawbacks to fiscal policy. And so we're going to go through a few of these, and we'll discuss them sort of one by one. One of the drawbacks, and it certainly is a significant drawback, probably the biggest one of fiscal policy, especially when you compare it to monetary policy, and you'll see that in a couple of weeks. Monetary policy is very fast. It takes very little time to do things like changing interest rates. But fiscal policy is the opposite. It's slow. And the reason why is that there's a number of lags that occur between when a person tries to introduce a policy and when the policy actually starts to roll out and have benefits. There's four major lags that I've introduced, and they all kind of play a role in terms of delaying when you make a decision and when it actually has practical benefits. The first one would be a recognition lag. And essentially the idea with that is that when you're looking at a use of fiscal policy, it may take time for a government to realize that it actually needs to do something. Sometimes it's pretty obviously a thing. Like, for example, if this COVID crisis, it kind of rolled up on people within a matter of a week between when it was kind of a minor issue and something that was hugely substantial. And so I don't think there's really any recognition lag. The government knows that it has to get money in. But a sort of different story happened when I was first teaching with the recession that happened in 2008 and 2009. In 2008, you had a Stephen Harper Conservative government, probably not the biggest fans of using a lot of really interventionary government powers when they don't need to, that it had about 2 or 3 years in government and had been kind of, pretty steady in terms of its budgetary policies. They were going to try and run a balanced budget and sort of try to do well throughout 2008 and 2009. 2008 in the summer, there were some problems in the American housing market. There were a couple of major banks that started to do poorly and in a few cases failed. And it started to look more and more like it wasn't just a couple of bad economic events, but maybe it was actually going to be a worldwide recession. The Conservative government originally was not going to stimulate. They argued that in early 2008, in the summer, at least in the summer months, let's not panic. These are things that always happen. But as it became clear to them that these were not just isolated events, but that there was a risk of a really, really negative world domino, they ultimately recognized and decided that, okay, we have to spend money. Another government may not have taken as long to make those decisions, but the key point is that there was a recognition lag. It took a little bit of time for the spending to even really get off the ground in terms of its planning. Other lags occur not so much because you need to figure out that there's a problem to respond to, but in terms of just practically implementing what you want to do. If you want to pass laws as a government, unless you happen to have a time of war or emergency, you don't just pass laws by decree. We have a democratic process. You have to pass through 3 readings within the House of Commons. You have to pass through 3 readings and a series of debates in the Senate. And then finally, the Queen or her representative, the Governor General, or Lieutenant Governor, if you're looking at a provincial government, they have to give it their final royal assent. That last part, the royal assent, takes no time, but the actual debates in the House of Commons can actually take months, especially if it's contentious policy that may not be automatically approved by all parties. And so that decision lag can actually, in a democratic country, be very slow. If your country's not democratic, it's probably less of an issue. But again, that's a trade-off that I think most people would argue that are fans of democracy is worthwhile. But it does make fiscal policy slower. The third challenge is the implementation lag. If I want to build, let's say, for example, a dam to promote the Canadian economy, well, I can try to promote a dam if I want to, and I can build that. But I can't just sit there and say, okay, I'm going to build a reservoir and knock out a bunch of wildlife and build this dam next week. It doesn't work that way, especially for major public works, which is where a lot of the spending comes in terms of Canadian major fiscal policy. And so oftentimes those environmental assessments, the sort of planning, the gaining of resources that might be required, the working out of contracts, it can take a long time for certain kinds of stimulus to get into place. And in fact, oftentimes there may be a couple of year difference between the plan and the actual sort of shovels in the ground. Another example, look at things like infrastructure in terms of highways, roads, etc., subways. Toronto subways, I mean, it's sometimes almost comical how long it takes to actually go from deciding you want to do something to actually doing it and building it. And again, while that might be conceived of at one point in time as some form of stimulus spending, let's build a few more subways now because we need the money in the economy. By the time they actually get there, you may not really be helping your problem because it may be too late. And then the impact lag is just the idea that even once the dollars get there, it takes time to roll through the economy. And so the biggest issue, and I've taken the longest time I will any of these factors with it, is that fiscal policy, in short, and I'm not always short sort of in terms of my dialogue, but it's very, very slow. The lags are substantial, and it's not a quick and expedient way of dealing with a problem. The second challenge, and I've mentioned this before, so I'll go through it quickly, is that when you're looking at government, they may have difficulty deciding to change spending and tax policies. Typically, spending more money and doing things to reduce people's taxes is never unpopular. So expansionary fiscal policy is pretty easy politically to use. The problem is more so with the contractionary end. Usually government kind of knows when things are good that they should cut back, at least from a budgetary perspective. But actually trying to do that and not alienate people who want things from government, who are maybe enjoying the good times and don't want to have to see, any kind of restraint, that can be difficult. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that sometimes government is not as restrained as they should be. If you look at actual government spending, you'll often see if you have a majority government, they do almost all of their cutbacks in their first 2 years of a 4-year mandate because they don't have to face an actual electorate. And then when you get into that last year, and the cynic in me is speaking here, but I think it's a general fact of life. You get into that year before an election and, we can open up our arms a little bit and spend more, even if it's not really the most prudent move in terms of the economy if you don't have a recession. The reason is obvious. Government uses your money to try to elect themselves or get themselves elected again as your government. But unfortunately, it ends up meaning that contractionary policy just might not always get used where it needs to. Usually when it comes to a sort of growth policy, it will get used if it's required. How much it gets used and whether or not people are satisfied, that probably depends upon the particular philosophies of the government of the day. A third major issue, which we've also discussed, and I've got it here for number 3, is the fact that when you use fiscal policy, especially the expansionary form, one of the big dilemmas is that you're almost invariably going to be adding to your national debt. And that's a major, major criticism people often have of a Keynesian approach, is that it often creates growing debts. Keynesianism was especially popular after World War II as the welfare state built up in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. But by the time you got to the end of the 1970s, some countries had not done a very good job of balancing out spending with cutbacks where maybe required in good years. And the end result was that their debts were just really, really high and it was creating problems. You do not want, as a planner, if you're being sensible, to have what they call a structural deficit. And the idea there is that deficits are natural of Keynesianism, but they're really only supposed to exist in theory, or should only exist in times when you have contraction. Because you have less revenue, you need to put more money into the economy, so inevitably there'll be an imbalance and there'll be a deficit. Where that would be what we would call cyclical deficit on its own. If you have a deficit because the economy is poor, well, of course, the business cycle forced you into it because of the sort of imbalance it creates. But if you get to a point where in good times, you have so much spending that you've committed to that even when you have booms in your economy, you still somehow have more spending than you actually have in terms of revenue. Then that's actually a dangerous thing, because that's a structural deficit. Essentially, what it means with a structural deficit is that it doesn't matter where the business cycle is, your economy is structured in such a way that you're always going to be spending more than you're paying back. And in fact, it will just get worse in bad times, but won't fully sort of balance itself out in good times. The picture here just kind of goes over some of the problems you'd seen in Canada in the 70s and the 80s. This is the 80s and then into the 90s. 80s, they were starting to pull out, but it was still a slow process, especially with a couple of recessions in the early 80s and the late 80s as well. What ended up happening, or actually early 90s, what ended up happening is that the debt was building up so much that, each year you were taking almost 10% of your GDP was just debt that the government or deficit where the government wasn't paying what it needed to. Eventually, it became a problem. People were telling the Canadian government that you have to pay a certain amount of interest on your debt. For every dollar that we raised in tax revenue, we were paying 30-40 cents just on paying interest, not even paying the debt down. Well, that crowds out your ability to spend, because if every dollar you raise, you're spending 30-40% just servicing a debt, not even really dealing with it other than not defaulting, then you have a problem. And so certainly that was something that was an issue. And in a general sense, you don't want to overdo expansionary policy, because if you do and you don't balance it out, then you end up with a debt that can crowd out your ability to spend in the long run. A fourth factor that's important when you're looking at drawbacks of fiscal policy is conflict. One of the dilemmas is that we have a federal system in Canada, United States as well, and you don't always have agreement between federal and provincial governments. You may have a situation where, let's say hypothetically, you have a federal government that's a very fiscally conservative government. They probably, if you had a decent sort of period in your economy, would actually be contracting, holding back, restricting output in terms of government spending, and trying to pay down debts and keep things under control. Whereas you may have a government in a province where, if it's a more sort of liberal-minded government, or let's say, for example, like a left-wing type NDP government, they may not, if they don't feel like everybody in the economy is benefiting equally, they may not have that level of fiscal restraint. And they may actually say that, especially if the economy is kind of in the middle, well, the Conservatives are cutting back, but federally, we think we actually need to stimulate. And so they may be stimulating and using expansionary policy, because that's in their sort of, I guess, mindset, what they want to do. The federal government may be using a contractionary policy, and in the end, they kind of go against each other, and you end up not really gaining or sort of, I guess, losing. It's just kind of they each go the opposite direction. When you have major periods of crisis, then it's usually pretty agreed upon that you need to have expansionary policy. There's not going to be those debates. But when you have periods where it's kind of in between, the economy is often in between. It was there just a couple of months ago. Then in those particular situations, it's sometimes hard to get government on the same page. And if different levels of governments have different expectations of what fiscal policy should be, again, it can be contradictory. A fifth problem that may exist is that regional variations may interfere with the policy's implementation. Again, while you can target certain regions and use an expansionary in one region and a contractionary in another, you have to understand, and this is why it can be a drawback as well as a benefit. So I've got on both lists that that's not always going to be an easy thing to do. If the government in, let's say, for example, Quebec is in a situation, or Ontario, where things are okay, and they were a couple of months ago, then you might tell them, well, let's keep a moderate policy. But if Alberta, which has had a lot of troubles in the last couple of years, is struggling, and they ask for money, well, it might be appropriate to give some more money, because they need that boost more than other regions do. But if you're a taxpayer in Ontario and you see that there's a boost there and you're not getting equal funds, you may feel kind of cheated, and you may pressure the government not to be unfair. Sorry, I'm doing quote signs. And so what ends up happening in that situation is that sometimes those regional variations may make it very difficult to use the targeted kinds of fiscal policies that you would want to on a regional level if the economy is not always in equally good health everywhere. Sixth point is the last big one I want to talk about, which is the crowding out effect. We talked about how if you build up your deficit for too long and you have a debt, it may make it hard to spend money. And you may be crowded out from what you can do in terms of an expansionary policy if your debt is limiting how much funds and how much money you have available to you in the current term. Another form of crowding out also happens when you have large debt. And it has to do with what happens in the investment markets when you're looking for loans as a government, and how you may actually compete with other people, which may hurt the sort of goals of your policy. Sometimes when government is in trouble, and the economy is in trouble, they may decide that they're going to borrow to try to improve the economy. So they'll go to the their bond market, or they'll go to some other kind of creditor within the economy, and they'll ask for funds. The challenge with that, though, is this. Your goal, and you can hopefully see this, you can read through this when you get a chance later at home, but your goal in those situations where you're borrowing is to take your down economy and use the borrowing to gain funds, which through government spending will get your aggregate demand closer to its target of full employment. However, when you try to borrow, you become a competitor in a loan market that includes other people who may be spending money. And so as the government, your efforts to try to gain funds will mean that there's now, and this is the market for loans, more demand for loans. I should have put a D1 there, but there's more demand for loans. And as you compete with private investors, interest rates may start to rise because of the fact that now the government, as well as private companies, needs a lot of money and is demanding. Higher interest rates will make it harder for businesses to invest. It will make it less attractive for consumers to spend money. And so the irony is that the loans that the government is taking are facilitating government spending, which generally is pushing aggregate demand to the right. But if it causes interest rates to rise as a consequence of having to compete for those loans, then you may actually see a drop of aggregate demand a little bit this direction. And you can write this on your sheets if you want. The drop is often caused by consumption and investment falling, and that happens because the higher interest rates lowers the desire for those particular spending, I guess private spending actions. Okay, the last point I want to make is a sort of quick one. Final issue when you're looking at fiscal policy is the fact that when you have a fiscal policy, it often creates deficits and debts. It often ends up meaning that the government owes money to certain people. And in fact, those people will profit off the fact that the government owes. They have to give a favorable return to get money. Otherwise, nobody would give them that money. It ironically ends up meaning that the people who can afford to buy things like bonds and can afford to loan the government money will end up profiting from the wealth that they were using to give the money back to the government over the long run. And the more that you build up a deficit, if you use a lot of expansionary fiscal policy, the more you may actually be taking taxpayers' money and ultimately giving it to wealthier people who are able to profit from having the funds in the short term. They are helping the economy by buying bonds, and by the way, is just a loan made by an individual to the government in exchange for more money over time. They are supporting the economy in a way, but they're also sort of serving their own interests, because of course they're not buying the bonds just to help people. They're also buying them because they want to make money, and ultimately the government will pay more back, and the interest will be going from taxpayers over time to the bondholder. And when you have a lot of debt, that's a lot of money just going from taxpayers to a few wealthy people with a lot of bonds, simply because of the fact that the government owes a lot. Okay, so number of different reasons why fiscal policy may not always be so ideal. Certainly it's necessary and it's very useful, and I gave you reasons at the start why, but obviously sort of considerations that government would have to make about why it may not be the perfect thing in all circumstances, and of course those are the points we just went through. All right, last point I will make is, if you're going to be looking at your homework for tonight, it's pretty light. I've given you a couple of questions in the textbook to look at. This is the last of the first 2 weeks worth of these lessons that I've put together. So in a future date, when I'm a little bit more certain on where we're going, we'll talk about whether or not we may eventually have a test. If we do come back to school on April 5, then yes, and I'll discuss that in a couple of weeks. If not, we'll probably have some kind of alternative assessment that'll work in. More details will follow on ESB. So for tonight, just do pages 233 to 240, and then anything else that's sort of suggested on the ESB entry for today. Okay, thank you.